Hello, I'm Emilie Bellet, founder of Vestpod and author of You're Not Broke, You're Pre-Rich, and you're listening to The Wallet. Every week we bring you the best tips, guidance, and a good dose of inspiration and motivation to help you manage your money better. In today's episode, I speak with Suhair Khan, a technology entrepreneur and creative leader. Suhair is the founder of Open-Ended Design, a platform dedicated to driving impact across design, culture, and tech. With more than a decade of experience at Google, Suhair has led numerous innovative projects in emerging markets, sustainability, and culture. We dive into the world of artificial intelligence, exploring what AI really means and addressing common misconceptions about this rapidly evolving technology. Suhair shares her insights on the transformative potential of AI in sectors like healthcare, climate, education, and finance. Many people have no idea how a pension works. Enter PensionBee, a leading online pension provider who's on a mission to make pensions simple so that savers across the UK can have a happy retirement. PensionBee's website and app make it simple for customers to combine their old pension pots, contribute flexibly, and withdraw their pension money all in one place. Download the app to get started or head to pensionbee.com for more information. And remember, when investing, your capital is at risk. I'd love to start, with something really basic. We hear the words artificial intelligence, AI all the time now. But in simple terms, what does AI actually mean?
Okay, well, it should be a simple answer because at the core of it, artificial intelligence is based off of algorithms that help to organize data. And as data grows, the kind of computation power needed will increase because lots more computations have to be conducted. In the way that AI systems have developed in what we call the second AI wave, which is only the last, let's say, 15 to 20 years, there has been a huge growth in these technologies because you have large technology companies with the resources to increase processing power. But at the core of it, AI is a field with multiple subfields, including machine learning, computer vision, what we know today of as natural language processing. But really, it's about organizing data and helping us make sense of vast amounts of data, helping humans essentially make sense of large amounts of data to achieve mostly efficiency-related outcomes. And that's what I think AI is. I think artificial as a term is actually misleading when connected to intelligence. When I was at Google, spoiler alert, we used to try to use the language around machine learning a lot more, particularly in our comms, because we just didn't feel comfortable with the use of AI and the language around it. But it just became the industry staple. And so it was something that wasn't really necessary to contend with until this moment right now where we're facing possible futures where machines and their intelligence is becoming more and more exciting, but also threatening in different aspects of society and business and governance.
Can you talk a little bit about intellectual property and the link with innovation? I mean, maybe here I'm just looking with the lens of, applications I use every day. You just mentioned, writing a book, producing content. This is now really easy. It's sometimes nicely done. And with a little bit of, as you say, conversation, human interaction, you can get like a really good outcome.
I think it's a really important conversation to have. And the truth of it is that with regarding anything to do with IP or ownership or trademark, we are completely unresolved. When you speak to people who lead policy at platforms like Netflix or any of the big technology content companies, they say, eventually fair use law will help to protect the creator. And so why, for me, IP is interesting and ownership is because it's about ideas. It's about fundamentally what comes from the minds of humans and where it could go. And we're in the midst of a swirl of legal battles around the world. With large technology companies on this. So the easiest example probably to use is the Hollywood writers' strike, which happened last summer and will likely probably continue. There was a deal made between actors in Hollywood, writers in Hollywood, with, let's say, their trade union, to say that if you're an actor, your likeness will not be used without your consent or at all in any future productions. And similarly, if you're a scriptwriter. So what does that mean? It means that for the first time ever, we're not quite sure if we, as human scriptwriters, are going to be as good or worse than or better than a machine. And so it's a fundamental shift in what does it mean to be able to create and how meaningful our role is into the future. And what's happening with law is that, of course, it's catching up in a sense that there are now cases in court, multiple ones. The New York Times is currently in a legal battle with OpenAI and Microsoft for illegally consuming New York Times content and using that to train the algorithms of OpenAI. The Authors Guild of America is in a similar battle. On the other hand, other companies are, or media companies or platforms are thinking about the opposite. It's like, how can I gain from this? Let's just join them, you know? So the Washington Post, I think News Corp, multiple media corporations are now signing very clear deals that are giving them cash for content. What does that mean? What does it mean for how we value information, news, journalism, the collections of museums and libraries? Who decides what the value of that is? And when we think about IP, this is a totally unresolved space. We will come to some kind of solution. It will take some time. In the middle of it, you know, let's say the New York Times in the next couple of years, when they get to court with OpenAI, possibly becomes a loser because they're spending money on something that isn't, you know, their content is out there now. You know, it's not retrievable. So I think with AI, one of the reasons we're talking about art and creativity a lot, because people think it's about AI art, which is, it could be, but also is because it's one of the few times that a technology, at least in our lifetimes or in the recent past, confronts the idea of human creativity, the human imagination. What does it mean to see things and to see the world in ways that other people don't? You know, creative people always say, oh, it's easy for me to come up with a new idea. Of course it is. And why is that? It's because of your lived experiences, your lifetime of practice, the effort, the friction of what it means to paint something over and over and over again. Same with filmmakers. And so is it replaceable or not? We don't know right now. But from a legal perspective, creatives are not being protected in the ways that they should be. And that is because the law has not caught up where AI is going. It's moving far too quickly for that to happen. And eventually we might get to that point. Last year, there was a song, it was a collaboration between Drake and The Weeknd, and it was made by AI. We don't know if the person, his name is Ghostwriter, was a bot or a human, what sort of entity it was. And also then there's a question around, okay, so this song is now on Spotify and it was designed by, let's say, a bot. It's made of AI for sure. And what if it's being listened to by bots? So then what happens? Who gets money for it? And so neither artist, Drake or The Weeknd, could figure out best how were they going to get royalties out of it? Could they take it down? There was no law in place for that to be resolved. And in the context of their careers, it's kind of a fun little meaningless moment. But when you think about the creative sector overall, that could be transformative and also destructive in many ways for how we've made, written, created, and consented up until this point with our work. And I think once it leaves and shifts from content in the creative sector, this is an issue that's going to confront many other industries where data, intellectual property, ideas are at the forefront of what holds value.
You mentioned the bots, and I'm thinking, you know, we're in election period in a lot of countries. You know, what about deepfakes, hacking? You know, AI can be used and is being used for harmful, you know, activities. What measures are in place to prevent AI from being misused at the moment?
There is a fundamental challenge around the technology of it. And so although, for example, the EU Act of 2025 is the one that's sort of universally accepted to be the most thoughtful, interdisciplinary, and values-based approach to AI regulation, in this moment, it's very difficult to confront what's happening with deepfakes. There's many companies out there, including DeepMind, Adobe, and so on and so forth, that are building tools and technologies to allow for the recognition of what is an AI-generated image, artwork, asset. You know, Instagram has just put up a little sign where you have to say this is AI-generated. And certainly there is the impetus to build technologies that allow for the fact that something is made of AI to be noted and documented. It's currently not across all media. It's mostly across visual assets. I think also maybe videos now, depending on what program you're using. But then the provenance and the source of it. Where do you figure out where something actually came from? How do you break it down? How do you add up all of the pieces that are infinitesimal that ended up making an image that was guided by parameters set by however many numbers of individuals? And so there are issues around context and attribution in AI. I think those are the two biggest issues. Those are probably going to be the greatest legal challenges and societal challenges, and they're not resolved. In terms of elections, and this isn't new. So to be fair, this has happened in multiple elections where AI has been used to confuse people. And obviously, the core outcome that we have to have at the end of this is that we have to be more empowered to make our own choices, to educate ourselves. But why would we be so? If you're being confronted, however educated or empowered you are, with digital content, scamming, it's happening all over the world. And then deepfakes. How do you believe what you choose to believe, particularly when media and real media is expensive and difficult to access and behind firewalls? So I think these are issues that are as much about the technologies as they are about society, about access, education, critical thinking. And not one thing can be solved in a vacuum. Certainly, it's going to be problematic. But in other cases, AI has been used. In Pakistan, one of the big political opposition leaders has been jailed and is not allowed to communicate with anybody. And so his team has been using an AI-generated avatar to communicate, which is interesting, and it's a clever use of technology because he's also given consent to that outcome. And, there's newsreaders around the world now that are actually being able to speak and communicate in dialects in countries like India, because newspapers can't afford to have multiple news leaders. So things like translation, endangered. We could go on about that, but I do think that at the core of it, when you think about fake content, it's not going to go away. It's probably going to become more dangerous. It's going to be used in both warfare as well as in like kind of petty, trivial day-to-day matters. And we will get to a point of figuring out ways to actually use AI to understand it, to learn it, and to know it in the same way that big tech companies have used hackers to protect their encryption systems for years. But I don't think it's going to be solved, and it's just going to be one of the necessary outcomes of this age of AI in a way.
Because we're a podcast about money and finances, there's an angle I'm looking at and talking to women in the Vestpod community and talking to people about personal finances. AI will play such a big role in a lot of different sectors. I'm thinking finance, but healthcare. You talked about climate, education. Before we go into what can happen and what could be amazing for us, what I see today is sometimes people rely on AI, and you talked about ChatGPT, and ask questions, ask personal financial question, tell AI how much they earn, what should they do with their money. I've seen on some platforms people sharing maybe investment portfolios, where do they have their money, because we develop a personal relationship with AI when we're using it often. It remembers who we are, what do we like, the way we talk to each other. And it really becomes this personal assistant. But what should we do when it comes to, protecting our personal information and not being, dragged into this is, machine that's also learning a lot from me?
So I think that we have to consider the fact that in this moment, we're basically all labor for AI platforms. We are all part of the global labor force that's feeding it. So we read a lot about workers who are data collectors in places like Kenya and India who are paid a low, but let's say wage that is worth it for them to create our AI worlds. But that's all of us. And I think when you think about vulnerable communities, I always think about, frankly, young women as vulnerable in most contexts. And you should think about where you're exposing yourself. You should not trust the fact that your data is not going to be used to make profit for the organization with which you're engaging. There is a point at which it might be useful for you to do so, for which you might trust the fact that your data is not going to be tagged to you as an individual, that you're going to go into a bigger pool and might be helpful to you. But right now, we don't really have the protections to know that exists. And as I said, the regulation doesn't really extend to that in this moment. This is, an ongoing debate around what does it mean to use, in this case, of course, we're talking about generative AI. So companies like Chanel have decided that they are not going to use any form of generative AI in the design process. I'm sure they use AI, in all the ways that you and I do on Google Maps and Google Search and whatever else. And I think that's a very interesting decision, because when you think about a company like Chanel, what is it? Like, what is the essence of Chanel? You can't really quantify it. Of course, it's about the design. And if you start to, even if it's ring fenced, to abdicate that essence to machines, there is a risk that as an organization, you're abdicating the essence of what you represent to technology. And that might happen in the future. But I don't think right now many organizations feel safe enough with the protections offered by these systems and technologies in order to do it. So I would say my advice is always to make your own decisions, to ask yourself questions, and obviously to educate yourself, whichever platform you use, whichever bank you bank with, wherever you invest your money, is to do the research for it, and certainly not to sit at home and to assume that even if your identity is safe and protected, are you really helping yourself by sharing your personal information into a black box, as they call it, where the context of the answers you get is not going to be linked to you as an individual or your circumstances. It might have enough information to tell you what you might want to hear, but I don't think it might necessarily be useful. And I think there's also an issue right now with emotions and feelings, and ChatGPT-4 is much more sensitive and kind. It's not mean. This is like, public information. There's a lot of work that's been done. It's called, effective computing, which is about, emoting and attribution of emotions. There's a few startups in this space. That's problematic because it is misleading. At the end of the day, it's not a person. It's a set of algorithms that are useful if you find them to be useful for yourself. And so in this case, it's hard to find the right answer. It's hard to afford financial advice. It's hard to afford, the support that you might need. But I would say not to trust the results that you get as results that you should follow up on. There's millions of examples already of people getting like the most ridiculous advice. When it seems ridiculous, you know that it is. When it's harder to parse out the nuance of it, you should just not necessarily trust it without educating yourself. And that's a fundamental issue right now with the way AI works. It's too easy. It's too frictionless. As I said earlier, we don't all have the answers, and neither does a computer algorithm. It's trained off of data that we don't know where it comes from. We certainly know that it's built in the silos of computer science, engineering teams, and mostly large technology companies. And if anything, where really interesting research and outcomes will happen is on the margins, in sort of the pods of the world, where many young people, many creative people, many technical people are building new systems, new models within ring-fence data, which could eventually be helpful. And maybe you could start a community, Emilie, in that space down the line. But I think just to remember, you are labor. When you use any of these platforms, you are feeding and training the data. Fair enough if it's useful, but it isn't an exchange that is not you giving something up also.
Thank you. That reminds me of the conversation we used to have about robots. The more human they looked, the less you should probably, trust them, and that develops a different relationship. So should we keep robots as robots, or do robots needs to be more human?
You can Google robots. Like, there's like some scary robots out there. There's like the Animalie, like they look like dinosaurs. And the dogs. And yeah, they're really scary. Wow. I hate that stuff. But I think this comes to the conversation around intelligence, right? Like, what is machine intelligence and what is human intelligence? And at some point we have to think about, where are we empowered? What are the choices we have to empower ourselves to make choices that make us feel comfortable? And it's very easy because of technology. That's why social media has been destructive in many ways, because you kind of lose agency. You find it addictive. You find that it's a way of not having to engage in many ways with the world. It can be fun and entertaining. And that's not necessarily always a good thing. And where do you find the balance and train yourself to meditate, to be mindful, to shut your phone off? And there's always going to be that yin and yang. Robotics is going to be transformative to medical science. I mean, when you think about the possibilities of AI for helping people who are paralyzed to be able to maybe move, when you think about neurodiversity and the support that many of these platforms are already providing in universities everywhere around the world to articulate themselves, to find the right tone of voice, to feel comfortable in communicating, that's incredible. That's huge. It's transformative to somebody's life, but we don't always necessarily think of it as such because it might not always be relevant to us and it might feel like it's trivial. And I think those are the places in which we should find the uses of technology. And I think as you think about your own career, whatever you do, of course, it's going to impact your job. It might impact your salary. Your skills are going to become atomized. But that's for you to figure out as you figure out yourself, and not for you to confront as one huge wall of like nightmare and dog robots that are coming at you, because that's not necessarily how it's going to happen.
When we talk about the good of AI now, you talked about healthcare. What are some of the most promising benefits of AI in different sectors?
So I'm really interested in climate. And what I've seen so far with climate is that AI has been amazing at supercharging our organization of data. So this is random. You can tell me to stop it. So when you think about Earth data, it's super messy because, it's not always collected in the right format, the right parameters. It's also infinite. You could collect any infinite number of parameters on the atmosphere, on temperature, on water, on species, on biodiversity, and often not with the same methodologies or protocols. AI has been transformative in helping to organize what we call messy data. What it hasn't helped us to do is to solve the future where we go. That's up to us. That's up to scientific research. And I think that's how we need to think about AI right now. It can really transform how we see what's available to us, how we organize but without the intention of figuring out what does it mean to clean water, to remove acidification from oceans, to reduce carbon emissions. Without the context of that, it is just another tool. I think in medical science, like another example, which is very famous, is AlphaFold, which is Google DeepMind's. It was basically AI applied to protein folding, and it's helped with so many other use cases in healthcare. And the thing I'm most interested in, and I'm not an expert in, is looking at neglected diseases. So in medical research, obviously, there's limited resources and there's all of the incentives pushed by pharmaceuticals companies and lobbying groups and obviously money. So-called neglected diseases have just been neglected. But what AI presents is the possibility for research that's supercharging in diseases that very few people might have, or maybe very poor countries might have. They still have polio in Pakistan. And this happens all over the world. So for me, that is fascinating, is how do we think about the margins? How do we think about people who are neglected, and can AI help to protect them or to make their lives easier or better, and to solve for what's not at the center? And that is if we think about building AI with empathy and with the thought of what it could accomplish, where I think we could see amazing outcomes. So in that case, DeepMind has partnered with an NGO that works on that space. And if you think similarly about how large technology companies have partnered with NGOs looking at endangered languages and indigenous cultures, really like the margins of our planet, but with outcomes that could be beneficial for all of us, that is where I think there's incredible possibility and opportunity. But again, what I will say is that it will help in the organization of data. It might spur the collection of more data. It will probably help in sharing, in presenting scenarios and possibilities, but it's not going to solve our problems.
Do you have any examples in education of finance, maybe, that you could share, stuff you've seen that's, really cool and we could use?
So Google has just launched this thing called Learn LM, which is really thinking about how to use AI to present more personalized learning, which I think is really interesting. I think that, you have the core issues still of that's not universal because we have digital poverty, we have lack of access to the internet, and also it's not necessarily easy without a teacher to use any of these tools. But I think that if we think about more personalized learning and if AI can help us to create safe spaces for young people as they grow, that could be fascinating and very exciting.
And actually, you talk about, climate and energy. I don't know, I was just reading this week that Google's AI search uses 10 times more energy than a Google search.
I'm sure that's true. So the statistics are really hard to measure, and some of it is not disclosed by tech companies. For me, the most interesting, so let's just say that Google and probably Microsoft are now doing a lot of work to be so-called carbon neutral or carbon positive, and they have really clear goals and invest a lot of resources in all of that they do, which is great. But the fact is that they're generating carbon, which is going into the atmosphere. So if you think about the reality of that happening to our planet and then them fixing it somewhere else, that's still happening. And that's something that's really unaddressed, and it's happening without any clarity as to when that trajectory will really slow down realistically. Most data centers that use where AI, there is computation related to AI that are now being built next to water bodies, deep American rivers, because they generate so much heat. It also causes a huge amount of water evaporation, which there's multiple studies on now. I don't want to misquote, but there's a paper by 4 professors at UC Riverside in America from last year. And I think it's equivalent to like Denmark, like the water evaporation in Denmark is Microsoft's data centers using ChatGPT. So it's the reason I say this is it's not just carbon emissions, which is what we hear about. It's water. It's also extractive, It's taking raw materials out of the Earth's surface. It's very physical. At the end of the day, these are physical outputs. And so even though I think a lot of industry-leading work is done within the large technology companies and thinking about emissions, because don't forget that telecoms companies are also responsible for huge amounts of emissions and water wastage, and they should be following the lead of what happens with tech companies. The numbers are just completely staggering. And the fact that we still have, in my mind, conferences like COP, and the conversation at Davos this year was literally all about climate and war. But at the end of the day, those who innovate are in a totally unrestrained and unregulated way, designing technologies that require that level of impact on our environment is kind of unbelievable. And it's not being questioned. And it's also not being held back because there's also a geopolitical element to AI now. So it's happening all over the world. I think we don't have any answers. All we have is like these sorts of investigations and what companies choose to share. It is about carbon, it is about water, it's about resource. And also, sustainability is not just about environmental damage. It's about social inequality. It is about labor. It is about exclusion. And I think from all of those perspectives, AI is extractive as an industry. Having said that, it could also hold the key for many of the issues that we have right now in environment, in health and climate. But if we're not empowered as societies and individuals to go that way, we should not be abdicating that to the large technology companies to decide which forests they want to buy, which climate startups they want to invest in, where they choose to do good. That should really be governments leaning into, thinking about our environment and our planet in different ways. And so I do think it's quite intractable right now. And it's something that nobody's answerable for at all. And if anything, these sorts of conversations that are ongoing around climate futures that feature front and center or people from technology companies should really recalibrate the fact that they're inviting them at all, given that they're responsible for participating in some of the biggest impacts on climate right now.
I wanted to ask you a question about how do you use AI personally, or what's, everyday applications?
I use all these platforms kind of more because I'm playing around with them then because I'm finding them useful to myself. I'm writing a book, and I'm very pleased to say it is so chaotic and so messy that no AI could ever have done it. I tried in the beginning, to like supercharge myself.
Yeah, of course.
And I've done it like, where I find it really useful is like when you have a dream business, and I've like made millions of extra business plans, which I've done always in my life, but now I just can do them all the time and get amazing ideas for white papers and things that I never accomplish. So in that sense, I think it's, it's incredible. It's amazing. And I find it really useful. But at the core of it, what I do want to talk about is how we think about using AI to help ourselves, not AI to help us. And I think it's easier said than done. But, I'll give an example of a creative person, the choreographer Wayne McGregor. He has worked a lot with AI over the course of his career. He worked with Google to create a new tool to help him to create new dance using machine learning off of his own previous, 30-year career. But he's now collaborating with a music AI platform called Bronze AI to think about how AI can create new outcomes in sound that could make the experience of the dancers and the set designer and the lighting designer shift in subtle ways, which will impact the audience, but also create a new kind of experience on the stage. It's really subtle. It won't change the world, but it's really thinking about how AI can be empowering in ways that are not dependent on, your next essay or the next functional conversation you need to have. And I think if we can push our use of AI from being, just efficiency related into being a little bit more about thinking about where it can push us to see differently, to understand something, to see the world in a new light, then of course it's fascinating. And I don't think we should be afraid of it. I think we should just be aware that from an ethical perspective, from the perspective of responsible development of technologies, we have to ask our own questions and also not be afraid that, things could go wrong. We should be in positions of empowerment where these technologies are just serving us. And I would say that I am probably still, I do put stuff into it, by the way, for the money people. I don't put money stuff into it, but I put like all kinds of things into it because
Me too.
I've always worked in technology. I've always known that like, when I had a Google phone, they always knew where I was. I used to get a beautiful map every year of all my travels, and then they made that public. And I used to be really happy with it, So I feel that for me, sharing has resulted in, useful outcomes in my own life. I think that where we do have an issue is much more global, which is about thinking about those who benefit and those who don't. And that it applies to every society. It applies to much of the world. And if we're complicit in that, and if we want to be complicit in it, then we have to ask questions of ourselves. I'm usually somebody who's more open to technology, playing around with it and enjoying it, than, being worried, because I don't think ChatGPT necessarily is going to turn into the dog robot and jump out of my screen anytime soon.
Thank you for listening. Before you move on to your next listen, copy the link to this episode. We're trying to get free financial education to women, but we need your help to do that. So if you enjoyed this episode, send the link to a friend who might learn something from it too.